I'm excited to hear from the leaders on our next panel, The Road Ahead, A Vision for Shared Prosperity. I'd like to remind you the panel will have a live Q&A following the opening comments, so please get your questions ready. And now I'm delighted to introduce this session's sponsor, ConocoPhillips Canada, to welcome our moderator and our panelists.
Hello, and welcome to the BC Natural Resources Forum. I'd like to thank the organizers for the opportunity that's afforded us all to collectively address a topic of incredible importance, which is the building and maintaining of a resilient natural resource sector in BC and in Canada. The theme of this year's event resonates especially well after the rather challenging year that we've just had. Despite the market and the challenges posed by the global pandemic upon us all, I'm proud to say that ConocoPhillips grew our business in this great province in 2020. We nearly doubled our acreage in a liquids-rich Montney. As important is our relationships with our communities and with Indigenous people. These relationships are central to how we do business. We seek to enter into agreements with Indigenous communities that are neighbors to our operations, demonstrating our commitment to sustainable relationships and define expectations for mutually beneficial solutions. We know that the road to these agreements begins with early and continuous engagement that requires authentic and collaborative dialogue. Our goal is to build trust and respect and strong relationships while we work together to create a shared vision and action plans that again generate a shared value. Our approach to engaging with our Indigenous neighbors is consistent with the principles of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which is the topic of our next panel. It is my pleasure to introduce Dallas Smith, President of the Nanwakolas Council, who is our moderator for what I'm sure will be a thought-provoking discussion. Thank you.
Welcome to this afternoon's panel discussion, The Road Ahead, A Vision for Shared Prosperity. It's my pleasure to introduce this great lineup of speakers. Today we have joining us my good friend Kim Baird, owner of Baird Strategic Consulting, Chief Corrina Leween, Cheslatta Carrier Nation, Chief Harvey McLeod from the Upper Nicola Indian Band, and Kevin O'Callaghan, Partner, Leader, Indigenous Law, Fasken. It's an honor to be here today on the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nation to help moderate this fascinating discussion on what lies ahead. As a First Nations leader for 20 some odd years, when I first got involved in the cause, if you will, it was about making our communities better places to live. And then it got saddled with treaty making, and then that got saddled with reconciliation, and then that got saddled with anti-colonialism. But at the end of the day, we all just want to make our communities better places to live. And I think we're looking to put some insight into how we build some of those opportunities going forward from the ground up, and the kind of relationships and partnerships that are needed to do this. So it's a real tremendous opportunity to work with this panel that's here today and to get into this dialogue. So without any further ado, let's get into it. This is going to be a great discussion. I see we've got everybody online here. It's nice to see everybody. Chief Corrina Leween, why don't you start us off?
Okay. Well, thank you very much, first of all, for the invitation to join the panel and to work with the esteemed channel, the people that are on the panel with us today. It's quite an honor. So my name is Chief Corrina Leween, and I am the elected chief of the Cheslatta Carrier Nation. Cheslatta Carrier Nation is located in north central British Columbia, and we are considered to be a semi-isolated community. We have access by a logging road or a ferry. I also sit as vice chair of the Major Projects Coalition, and I've been closely following BC's UNDRIP legislation since it was enacted. Now the federal government has reintroduced their own UNDRIP legislation as Bill C-15, and I'm closely following that as well. I see a lot of good work in the DRIPA, and I want to acknowledge, first of all the work that has gone into this. legislation. I think it represents a willingness to work in a different way and in a better way moving forward for our people. For most Indigenous people, the Declaration itself is really about asserting our rights, telling the world that human rights are Indigenous rights and Indigenous rights are human rights. We have our own nations, we have our own laws, and we have our own governance system, and these have to be respected. But of course, nations work together every day all over the world. Asserting our rights isn't about creating conflict or animosity. It's about making sure that we are treated as equals, not told what to do or forced to do anything, but rather consulted as partners and rights holders. And I know there has been anxiety about the concept of free, prior, and informed consent, and whether that means veto. So I just wanted to share a quote from James Ania with you today. He was a special rapporteur on Indigenous rights and helped lead the Declaration to become accepted. He said, "The overarching objectives of free, prior, and informed consent is that all parties work together in good faith to make every effort towards mutually acceptable arrangements, allowing Indigenous people to genuinely influence the decision-making process." From that perspective, I hope to see that UNDRIP isn't about taking Indigenous people taken away from Canadians. It's about Canadians sharing power with Indigenous peoples. The Declaration is a beautiful document, and DRIPA is a good legislation. But of course, the real work comes from turning those words into action, and that's the stage we are at in BC. The implementation stage and the action plan stage. If UNDRIP is not fully understood and more importantly acknowledged, then it is yet another document that will sit on a shelf and gather dust. Its words will have no impact. That's why everyone, including federal, provincial, and municipal governments and corporations, must work with our First Nations to put the principles of UNDRIP into practice. I realize there's much needs to be completed, but I believe that first and foremost, we need to come to some mutual understanding of what UNDRIP is and what it is for. I have brought the Declaration work up in my community. Cheslatta used it as a guide to help us achieve historic settlements with BC and Rio Tinto. We continue to use UNDRIP principles in discussion with many of our business partners and with government. And at times I can clearly see that my audience doesn't know what I'm talking about. UNDRIP needs to be understood and recognized. For the First Nations Major Project Coalition, one of the ways to put UNDRIP principles into practice is to build capacity in our communities, to engage in major projects and resource development. The government has now made it provincial law that resource projects require our consent to move forward. If our nations don't have the capacity to conduct our own due diligence, to retain our own lawyers and advisors, to provide our own environmental assessments, and to meaningfully consult with our members, then we are not able to provide an informed consent. Most of us want to be able to say yes to development. We want to participate in the economy. We want jobs and revenues like all Canadians. So some of the most important ways to move forward on resource development in the province is to get rid of all the barriers our nations have in providing informed consent that your projects need to move forward. These are challenging times for the province and for Canada and across the world. But I can honestly say that our First Nations have been experiencing challenges for centuries. Affirming UNDRIP and respecting UNDRIP means acknowledgement that we exist and we have rights, and we are entitled to control our own destiny. We want to work with our neighbors and our partners, and we know it will be harder for us to be successful if you are not successful too. But we need to know that we have your respect and your understanding of our rights. This includes engaging with us and consulting with us when you do business in our respective territories and communities. That might seem scary to many of you, but if we do this right, for me, it doesn't mean that no one will benefit from resource development. In BC, it means that we all will. I'm very thankful for the opportunity to speak here today on UNDRIP. I believe it's a tool that we can use respectfully in each one of our communities and in the world in general to move forward on business development and economic growth and self-sustainability. So I really appreciate the time that I've had here today. And I thank everybody that's on the call.
Thank you so much, Chief Leween. Some tremendous points about the community engagement that's needed to understand what this tool actually is. The fear-mongering that goes around pieces of legislation like UNDRIP and DRIPA and the various supporting legislation that's coming in is just something that our communities need to find a better way to spell out so we understand the opportunities that it brings and the responsibility that it brings. So I really want to thank you for your input there. Chief Harvey McLeod, how's it going in your neck of the woods today?
Good afternoon. It's good. It's a good day. So good afternoon, everybody. Yes, good afternoon. Good day, my friends and relatives. Yes, my name is Harvey McLeod, and I'm the Almichum Chief for Upper Nicola Band here in Okanagan Territory, Sealch. It's good to be here, and I really thank the organizers for reaching out and asking me to share a few things about our world right now. And of course, prayers and thoughts going out to all of our people all over the country, all over our nations that are going through some really hard times. And we're just starting to feel the impacts here in Upper Nicola. UNDRIP, it's been discussed by many, many leaders over many, many different tables, just exactly what it is and how we're going to implement, how we're going to understand. And of course, here in British Columbia, Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. When I talk about it, I can have a reasonable discussion with my fellow leaders around the province or across the country on what it could mean, what it could do, how it can change our world. But when I get into the community, it's a different story. We have had many, many government officials, companies come in and promise us the world, that our life is going to change, that we're going to be given more supports for the needs of the people. And a lot of the times them needs didn't occur. We are no further that day than we were before the discussions happened. So they come in with a lot of apprehension about exactly what are you talking about. We've heard this story before. You've made that promise before. And how do we move forward? And so we need a lot of discussion in our community on exactly what that looks like. And we're having that. Thanks to COVID and the pandemic, it's allowed us to stay home and really get to know who we are, who our people are, who our family, who connect with our family, connect with community. And of course, really take a close look at ourselves. And it's changed. For example, we look at DRIPA, UNDRIP, and say, yes, let's sit down and talk about and implement the act. And we don't really know how to start. Government doesn't know how to start. And we flounder around. And I go back to where we are at Upper Nicola. Where are we? I'm a chief, as identified under Section 9124 of the Indian Act. Doesn't give me very much responsibility. It keeps me in a very small space. And for what we want to do, we're going to have to move out of that. And we're doing that now. We're having a look at our governance structure and saying that if we're going to be involved in these discussions, then we got to change ourselves. We got to change ourselves as well. And that's huge. And when we're changing, Our governance, our people also have to change, and they have to be involved. They have to be accountable. They have to be responsible. So all of that is happening while we're talking about DRIPA. And then developing the working relationship with each other, to build some trust, to have some trust in my fellow neighbor here on this res, have some trust with the government officials that we're going to be sitting down and having dialogue with, having trust with the companies that are coming in and wanting to do work in our territory. So all of that has to be built up, and a solid foundation built on honesty, trust, and what's that word, where I have and can place my respect in who you are and what you say and what you do. So it's a matter of developing a process where we're moving forward together, and decision makers are talking to decision makers. When UNDRIP was first introduced, I had a look at it. As a leader, I had a look at it. And after reading them, I went back to the start and had another look at the document. What it told me is that for the first time in the history of this country called Canada, I was acknowledged as a human being. That is huge. And I wouldn't have been able to do that if I never did my own work on what happened with me over my lifetime. So it's telling me that, hey, Harvey McLeod, you're not 69700222101. You're Harvey Matthew McLeod. You're a human being. So that makes all the difference. And that's where I'm starting from when we start talking about UNDRIP DRIPA and the relationships that we're going to be developing with both crowns, the province and the federal government. So it's a huge opportunity, and I'm really looking forward to how we're going to do this together. So with that, why limit? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chief McLeod. Tremendous insight into part of the accountability that comes to us as First Nations people to make sure not only do our people and communities understand the potential of the tool, but to actually make that accountable and understand what it means to sit at that table and make those decisions and have the respect that it takes to understand the accountability that comes with that. And I think that's something that we're seeing growing more and more. And as we've gotten to get better at doing MOUs and impact benefits agreements with companies and with the province, we see this starting to happen at a little bit of a faster pace. Maybe Kevin, you can come in and give us your thoughts on just how some of this comes together for you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dallas. First, I'd like to add my thanks for being included as the lone lawyer in this group of dignitaries. It is truly an honor. I work mainly for resource companies who do their work out on the land in British Columbia. And when I first started in this area over 20 years ago, it was all about conflict. But in 2004, the Haida case came along and things changed. Government and corporations reacted, slowly at first, but with more acceptance. So that by 2010, my work is predominantly around negotiations and finding ways to bring First Nations into projects. The vast majority of the companies that I work for are genuinely searching for ways to involve Indigenous people in a project, from traditional knowledge and environmental study design through to direct equity involvement in the project itself. Finding a way for local Indigenous community to not just accept the project, but through the development of a relationship to think of that project as their own. There are many different paths for such a relationship to develop, and the choice of path will depend on a myriad of different variables, from the experience of Indigenous community with that sector, to the size and type of project, to capacity issues, to just name a few. Finding a mutually acceptable and mutually beneficial way forward is the goal. This is never an easy task, but it is one worth pursuing. I am sure that you have all heard about the concept of certainty, perhaps too often, and how important that is to businesses making massive investments. It is about minimizing the risk for those investments. What companies have come to realize is that certainty can be gained through partnerships and relationships with Indigenous communities. In order to achieve those partnerships, there needs to be an understanding of the rules of the game, of the goalposts. We all know that things change over time, but if there is no common expectation and understanding, this inhibits the development of relationships. It is hard to build a relationship on shifting sands. The importance of these common expectations has been highlighted by the development of legislation recognizing and accepting the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, first here in BC and now at a federal level. The UN Declaration is an important aspirational document that lays out the framework for recognition of Indigenous rights as human rights around the globe. However, the language used in it is not the detailed language that you'd expect in legislation, and therefore it can lead to different interpretations. This in turn can lead to diverging expectations, which is the enemy of common expectations necessary to be the foundation for partnerships. And further, if expectations are allowed to diverge too far, that creates conflict. To avoid diverging expectations, governments will need to be transparent with how it interprets the UN Declaration and what obligations it sees arising from the document. There is no use glossing over different interpretations. Leaving discussion for another day is not in anyone's best interest. Waiting will only allow people to solidify their thoughts upon increasingly divergent paths, leading to industry being abruptly shut down in areas such as recently happened in the Discovery Islands, or actual conflict on the ground, as we saw play out in the Wet'suwet'en territory. When discussing natural resource developments on traditional lands, UNDRIP requires that a government consult and cooperate in good faith with the Indigenous peoples in order to obtain their free and informed consent prior to the approval of any project. There is much ink been spilt on the meaning of this statement, and I'm not going to get into the interpretive debate here today. Suffice it to say that there are different interpretations that fall broadly into two camps. Either it means that government must consult with the goal of obtaining consent, but can proceed without consent, or that governments must obtain consent. In order to provide the certainty that both companies and Indigenous communities need to build their relationships, both BC and Canada need to be very clear about which interpretation they are adopting for the purposes of implementing this legislation. As long as government is clear and consistent, then the sands will stop shifting and business and communities can get down to the hard but rewarding work of developing long-lasting and mutually beneficial relationships. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you, and I look forward to the questions.
Thanks so much, Kevin. Some great points there just about UNDRIP and DRIPA. The legislation helps provide some goalposts, but there's not really much delineation in between, and there's a lot left to be desired. And as a First Nations leader, that was always something that, okay, I like the idea of UNDRIP, but more has to be flushed out, to now it's been around long enough where, okay, this is a piece of policy we can work with, but it puts more onus on us as First Nations to define some of these characteristics and factors that need to be in there. And this is why it's wonderful to have you all on the panel, but to have Kim Baird here, because she was around doing this before it was UNDRIP and things like that, and determining the rules of engagement in the role she played in negotiating the Tsawwassen Treaty. So Kim, you've done it from a community perspective, a regional perspective. I notice people like you and our brother Sean Atleo are very busy helping other communities, just being able to understand what opportunities are in front of them and what they can use as tools to help them do that. So really looking forward to some of your insight on this.
Thanks, Dallas, and good afternoon, everyone. My ancestral name is Quintiel Tanat, which comes from my great-great-grandfather Quintielem from Tsawwassen First Nation, my community. I'm currently the Chancellor of Kwantlen Polytechnic University and do some board work, including with the Canada Infrastructure Bank and the Greater Vancouver Board of Trade. but I make a living being a consultant, and I advise on Indigenous issues. And most recently, I'm pleased that I've been asked to help organizations, businesses, and institutions to assist with some Indigenous reconciliation planning. So thanks very much for inviting me, and I'm very pleased to present with my fellow panelists. It's always tough to go last. I feel like I'll be repeating a lot of what they said, but it certainly is an interesting time in this country. A lot of focus is being turned to an economic recovery post-COVID, if we ever get post-COVID. But I also think this is a great opportunity to improve upon how things were. It's an opportunity to evolve and innovate. And I think the two matters of urgency before the pandemic were and still are the issues of Indigenous reconciliation and climate change. And I think that as we move forward, we can proceed in a way that keeps these issues at the forefront and get into a place of innovation and evolution. At least that's my hope. But these things can't be an afterthought as we rush to a post-pandemic recovery framework of some sort. The advancement of laws provincially and federally in relation to the need to comply with UNDRIP is constructive, part of the advancement of reconciliation, in my opinion. But I also think Indigenous reconciliation goes well beyond the residential school experience that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission shone the light on. We have to reconcile Indigenous rights and culture with governments of BC and Canada and provide paths forward for Indigenous communities, paths that they determine. And in the case of my community, we chose a modern treaty for our path forward. And it is helping advance my community beyond poverty and the Indian Act. Of course, this is only one framework. There are many others, and rightfully so, that are being pursued right now. And also, I've heard some fear about UNDRIP legislation. And I don't think we should fear it because it's merely a set of standards that respect Indigenous rights. In my opinion, respecting human rights is not anything that Canadians should fear, especially in a country as wealthy as ours. As Chief Leween already raised, people do wonder what ultimately free, prior, and informed consent will mean. And I don't think we will know for some period of time definitively, as I'm pretty sure case law will continue to evolve around these matters. But remember, many projects have successfully obtained consent and arguably already comply with UNDRIP standards pertaining to free, prior, and informed consent, or FPIC, as some people in the industry call it. And this happened long before legislation was passed or tabled, because frankly, it was the right thing to do. And this was because of direct relationships with First Nations and the successful involvement of government and industry in these projects. And while things still remain uncertain, and regulators will try to balance the public interest, Indigenous rights, and resource development, I think ultimately the best way to manage this risk is by direct relationships with First Nations. It's encouraging to see that many companies are revisiting their environmental social governance, or ESG, practices to ensure that matters of inclusivity and reconciliation are being looked at through various frameworks. And on the Indigenous side, that could be the TRC recommendations, UNDRIP, or any other framework that makes sense for their businesses. We all have a part to play with Indigenous reconciliation, and I hope those of you in this audience are thinking about ways to advance or continue advance reconciliation. Thank you, and I look forward to the conversation for the rest of this panel.
Thanks so much, Kim. You know, it's always amazing when you come together to talk about issues that are so across the province and then across the country with regards to how the legislation brings it forward, but how autonomous and individual the rollout and evolution is going to be. It's going to be interesting to see how different communities take these tools and use them to make decisions that make their communities better places to live. So I really want to thank the four of you for providing the insight to start some discussions and answer some questions from the audience. Just again, one of the key things that seemed to come from all of you was this is something that needs to be embraced by all of us. This isn't something that we should be afraid of. This isn't something we should be managing. This is something we should be using as a tool, as a discussion aid going further. Before all this is done, good companies built good relationships in the territories that they're working in. And we simply now see more tools for us to take new ventures and bring that level of respect to them as a starting point, as opposed to working their way to that. So thank you all very much. And let's move to some of the questions that I see being developed on the Whova app. I have to say Whova twice during the events today, or else we'll have to use a different provider next year. But all kidding aside, so we see different words bandied about on UNDRIP that seem to mean different things to different people. Can you talk about the difference between veto, consent, and consensus for our lay people? And I think Bing and I were talking about this in Prince George last year, and I can't remember who got the bar tab, so we couldn't figure out who was right versus veto and consent. But all joking aside, Chief McLeod, in your view, what do you see the difference between veto, consent, and consensus being?
Words that have scared so many people away from the tables that I've sat at, or even wanting to open discussion. What are you doing? How are you going to get it done? And how is it all going to work? When we seen and we started hearing and we started having discussions with proponents, with Crown, it was called consultation. And I got staff right now with paper from floor to ceiling, with referrals coming in each and every day, lots of them, about what's happening out on the land. And when we wanted to look for an alternative way of communicating with one another, to see what could be done, how it could be done better, how we're going to be included, how the land or whatever project was going to be worked on, how can we all ensure that things were going to work out okay. And of course, we have the legal world involved in this, and things like veto came in, saying that we're not going to put the work of so many people and demands of so many people into the hands or onto a table where the opponent can say, no, it's not going to happen. I don't think it ever was on my agenda that we say no. We wanted to find a way. And the definition of the word has gotten to the point now where it's not a very good word. But it was. So when I look at how we're going to have a relationship, that is one of them that's going to be a huge stumbling block for us to get through to the other side, onto the table. And this is what we're going to be talking about, and we're going to find a better way to get it done, with you included in it, with you at the table, you having full understanding about what's going on and the role that you're going to play in the development. But now it's become a paper war. It's become a legal war. It's become a point of defeating the table before it's even gotten off the ground. So let's not fear it. Let's not fear that Upper Nicola is going to come in and say no to a project. Or no, we're not going to do this, or no, we're not going to do that, and we're going to say finished. We have to survive one way or another, and we have to find a way on how we can be involved, included, and see that the responsibilities that we place on ourselves could be enshrined in the work that we're doing together. It is going to take a lot of trust in us having open, full dialogue, and not look around for the problems that could be problems, not identify the problems before it's a problem, but go in with an open mind and say, yeah, we're going to disagree on some things, we're going to agree on some things, and at the end of the day, we're going to be in a better place when it comes to understanding what you want, what we want, and how we're going to move forward. Thank you.
Tremendous, thank you. Maybe just one more on this one, Kevin. You know, you've been around 20 years like I have doing this and seen the good, the bad, the ugly. You brought up Discovery Islands. You know, we saw cleaner processes in other areas like the Broughton. What can you say about industry learning to be more patient about the difference between veto, consent, and consensus? Because I remember in the old days when someone would come to me, it's, we're going to do this, take it or leave it. If you don't like it, we're just going to do it without you. To where, ironically, over the last couple of weeks specifically, more companies are calling and saying, okay, what are the rules of engagement, things like that. So maybe just, you know, quickly some insight on how you've seen companies better understand the patience it takes to build these tools.
Well, I think that an important part of the discussion when you're talking about the difference between veto, consent, consultation, and consensus is caught up in the quote that I read out, which is the obligation on the Crown to consult, on the government to consult, and you know, by extension, then, you know, industry has to think about that. Is the goal of that consultation is the obtaining of consent. And that kind of switches the analysis, I think, a little bit from what it was under HIDA, and puts it more on a back and forth discussion about what it would take for a nation to feel comfortable consenting, what information is needed, what are the interests that need to be met and understood, what are the underlying concerns, and not just about, you know, the old complaint about, you know, consultations turned into the checking boxes going down a page. And I think it's turning the page on that and saying, no, that there needs to be, if you're going to go ahead, you need to have consulted in a deep way, and the goal of that consultation, and you need to be able to demonstrate that the goal of that consultation was in good faith to try to achieve the consent, the agreement of the nation involved, and that transition, I think, will be transformative for those consultations and that engagement going forward.
Tremendous. There's a lot of questions coming in now. I see the vote tallies and the votes are coming in. It feels like one of those reality shows where someone's going to get cut if they don't give the right answer to one of these questions. You know, Kim, you and I have had a lot of chance to be at events and talk after various conferences and things. This question almost made me chuckle a little bit because it just reminds me of some of those discussions we've had. Is what is the question you're most tired of hearing on this subject, and what would you like to say so that you never have to say it again?
Oh, where would I start? Really? I think the challenge is that most Canadians weren't taught the impacts of colonization to Indigenous people in Canada. And so we're all catching up to that. And it's very rare where I've met Canadians who hear about the terrible, atrocious history and don't want to do something about it, or are ashamed of it, or don't want First Nations to be stuck in cycles of poverty and that kind of thing. So I think it's important that these dialogues continue, and there will be some uncomfortable truths and some places where we need safe spaces to explore these topics. I always took issues of consultation within my own community very seriously, and consent, and tried to reach consent as much as possible. But it is a lot of work. collaborating is a lot of work because you don't have a set page of answers that you just have to tick the boxes. You have to jointly figure out what to do. And in the case of Indigenous communities, it's not really rocket science. If your project's going to impact Indigenous rights, you have to show how you've tried to avoid it at all costs, allow First Nations to see that assessment and how that has happened and participate in that work and designing, minimizing impacts to rights. And First Nations have to benefit from the project. And there's a number of ways that happens now, whether it be through equity participation or impact agreements that have procurement and employment opportunities, or both now. That's becoming more the norm, and it's kind of overdue in my opinion. So I guess it's a complex issue. The path to reconciliation is complex, and self-determination is hard because First Nations need to choose their own path forward in very complex situations where they're left with a legacy of challenges that weren't their own doing. So I think it's time for everyone to contribute to reconciliation where they can.
Wow, this is one of the first times I've moderated a panel and actually taken notes, so this is good stuff. And Chief Leween, you guys have been through a lot through your agreement with Rio Tinto, and I'm sure there was a lot of hard wrongs that had to be righted in the relationship going forward. In your experience, what's the number one way companies can make a substantial difference to a community?
Just given the historical stuff that has gone on in our community, my opinion is that from the ground up, like if there's going to be development in the community, the governments have to be involved, the company has to be involved, and our people have to be involved, and specifically our people, because they're the holders of the territory in which we live and how the impacts affect us on a day-to-day basis. So if everybody gets together and starts respecting the First Nations people as being the rights holders and the people that are on the ground living in the communities and dealing with the historical things that have happened to our people, starting there and then moving forward, but truly having, and I believe Chief McLeod said it, having a true a respect and an open transparency, and Kim might have said it as well, but I heard it over and over again, is just to have that identification of who you're dealing with and what the territory is like and who the people are, and then move into the development of projects within the community, but do it out of respect and transparency.
Thanks so much. One of the messages we're hearing here is just the importance of building solid relationships where you can have that little bit of an uncomfortable discussion, the respect to be able to tell your potential partner what's wrong. I don't like to link things back to my marriage, but the easier you can have those troubled discussions, the longer your marriage is going to last. And I think that's some of the context that we need to start looking at some of this in, is how do we make these longer generational relationships healthy over time. Chief Harvey McLeod, how can we advance the implementation of UNDRIP within the resource sectors? One of the things you said during your comments that I caught and actually made a note of was you had chiefs talking to decision makers talking to decision makers. So how important is to make sure that technicians are talking to technicians, bureaucrats sort of deal with bureaucrats, but when it comes to decision-making time, those discussions have to lead towards a discussion between decision makers. And what's your thoughts on that, with this question particularly?
It's a question and an understanding that takes a little while to really evolve inside one individual, inside of a council, inside of a community, on what are we talking about and what do we really want. Um, there were so many times that as an individual, as a leader, I would be sitting and listening and participating, but at the same time, not really, just because of the things that I needed to do for myself, to build some trust between different individuals or groups that I was working in, and to actually have confidence that I know what I'm talking about, and more importantly, to be seen as an individual. So when we're out there working and talking and developing, it's not only me sharing with you how I see things happening, but me listening to you on how you do things, how you do your work, so I can learn. And at the same time, me sharing with you what my values are, what my principles are, so that somewhere in the middle we'll be able to meet and make things good, make things not so complicated. But we don't do that. Um, and we're slowly starting to change that. I remember in 2018, August 30th, actually, there was a court. We went to court on a major project here in Canada, and the courts released their decision that day. And the chair of the National Energy Board was here in his community, and he wanted to have a meeting. We had that meeting, not in our boardroom, not in our hall, not in our gym, but in horse corrals, just 100 so of feet away from where I live right here. We had that meeting in that horse corral with some horses. This is my environment. This is how I function. I don't function in boardrooms. I don't function in grand ballrooms. I'm having a lot of discussion, but it's a little more personal. I'd like people to know who I am, and I'd like to know who you are. So after we finished that meeting that afternoon, the individual said to me, this is where we should be having our meetings. Here, in your territory, in your horse corral, with them horses saddled up there, and us riding on a horse and talking about what we need to get done. And he was saying there were some reminders and things that he understood about himself. One, that he was a son. Two, he was a husband. Three, he was a dad. Four, that he's a human being. And all of that came as a result of us standing in the middle of a horse corral, talking about the business and things that we want to see done and how they should be done and how we can make a difference supporting one another and moving forward. So it's really developing a deeper relationship than we've ever done before in our life. And I have to do it here with the people of Upper Nicola, with the people that we bring into the community to help us, with the companies that want to do business here. We have them kind of discussions now, and it is making a difference because they have a better understanding of what it means when we say Tenhulach, the land, or Inachenwich, how we make decisions, or the value of the water, or value of the trees, the value of the fish, the value of the land that you're going to be walking on, why it's so important. So it's some things that we share that develops a better understanding about who we are, and that it doesn't have to be so complicated. I don't have to override or step over me having some understanding of who you are as a person. Not who you are as the chief, but who you are as the person. Then we'll come up to the chief side. So and that takes work. That takes commitment. And of all of the work that you do, that's probably the hardest one. Why?
Thanks for that. As my good friend Chief Mike Labordius is always saying, is horses have limited BS tolerance, so maybe that's a good idea to move these meetings into those kinds of settings. But you really hit a note on again, the human nature side of it. You know, we can be First Nations. I can't remember who wrote the book, Doctor, Lawyer, Indian Chief. But there's so many aspersions that got put into these discussions that are just unnecessary cluttering. And the more we can get back to that human nature side, I think, you know, industry, First Nations, the province will all be off in a better place. Seeing these questions roll in and moving along, within the context of UNDRIP and DRIPA, can any of the panel members provide examples, no names unless you really want, where your community was approached and a poor job was done in developing a working relationship? And conversely, where was something that was a good job in what you'd done? And maybe I'll just start. I remember one guy called me up and he wanted to do water bottling in our territory. And he said, I just really want a cool logo. That's all I kind of want from you people. And it was just amazing. And this wasn't that long ago, how silly some proponents can be with the amount of research at hand today and Truth and Reconciliation Commission and all these other things that can just access to engage First Nations community. To get that phone call in the last 4 years was just kind of mind-boggling to me. But maybe, Chief Leween, maybe I'll ask you, what have you seen that you didn't like, and then conversely, what did you like with how some people approach you and your community?
Well, I think with regards to, you know, what was a poor job done, we all know the historical significance of the work that was done to create a dam and flood our territories and evict us from our traditional territories, never to return to this day. So, you know, I'm just trying to look forward and seeing, you know, what happened. We can't undo, but we can fight to get a better response from companies that come into our territories. And I really feel like we do. Chief McLeod mentioned it about being back on the land. And what we do here is we take and we give a cultural training to any of the companies that come into our territories. And it basically says who we are, and it asks who they are at the same time. And what is, you know, the end goal to working together? And I find that moving forward is really respectful in that manner. But at the same time, there were a lot of jobs that were not done, you know, to our satisfaction, and cost us a lot of lives, cost us a lot of people still in dependency mode right now. And I just believe that, you know, as we move forward, yeah, there were some really bad things that were done in our community, but we have, you know, held steadfast to ensure that we are involved in any kind of development in our community now, and that we have to have, you know, communication, we have to have respect, and we have to have an understanding who people are and how our people live and how they've lived forever and survived a catastrophe. So I would just say more communication. And we have a lot of companies now that we work with, and they come to us and they ask for, you know, a meeting to, you know, go over the prospect of business development with our community. And we always start at the cultural component of it. Who are we, and how have we survived the stuff that's gone on in our community? So I think communication is a great big part of having good jobs done versus bad jobs in our individual communities.
Kim, this is an interesting question. And again, I'm hoping I'll just keep dating one of you until you drop some names on me on who's done a shitty job, or I mean, who's done a not so good job on some of these things. But Kim, maybe you can take a crack at this question.
Which one?
Some of the poor. I mean, you were chief in a time where it wasn't required, and you probably had some doozies, I bet.
Yeah, I mean, hello BC Ferries, right? the first for Tsawwassen in that the way our elders tell it, the guy constructing the causeway knocked on the chief's door. That's how we found out that because the land had been expropriated through the Indian agent. But fast forward to today, people that are interested in impacting our rights in any intense way tend to come to us first before they have advanced their project scope to any level of government. So it's a huge cry from being told what a project is going to be to being asked if we're interested in potentially being a partner for those projects. And there's everything in between, combination in between of how proponents have approached us. But I think there are lots of successful projects in the province, and I think they all have similar traits in that they have developed those relationships and have made their own certainty when things are uncertain, at least in my experience.
Tongue in cheek, I almost want to say how much growth we've had to have as First Nations to be home, to at least have the door knocked on when someone's going to come do something of that magnitude in our territory. But I'm hoping BC Ferries will be a sponsor at one of our next events. So I'll just let you kick them once, Kim, and I'll retreat from that right now because I still got to get the ferry home next week. So. Kevin, I see the next question here. I see part of the implementation of the Declaration Act as an opportunity to review and consider how government and industry are working or could work with nation communities and Indigenous communities to create wealth. The question to the panelists is, what work is most important? And this is an interesting question because it has so many different tangents around expectations. Usually when people look at IBAs, impact benefit agreements, they think it's about a dollar amount and a term. And we all know that there's so much more that goes into that around training, capacity, and all those things. So in some of your experience and some of the deals that you've helped put together, what do you see really some of the meat in that sandwich being?
It's a really interesting question, and actually one of the most important questions to delve into early on in a relationship, because what's most important really depends on the community. So some communities have capacity, have businesses built already, and so their interest is really on they have interest in all the other aspects, but they're really interested in the procurement aspect, getting contracts. Whereas another nation might have none of that, but they have lots of people unemployed and eager for training and the opportunity to get employed. Whereas another nation might be less focused on those two things, but very much focused on environmental monitoring and being a steward of the environment and being there at every stage to ensure that things are taken care of. And that's the core thing that they're concerned with. And so there is no right answer in terms of what's the most important aspect. It's that discussion at the table, the honest exchange at the table that will help both parties realize where those priorities are and how things can be structured or changed or modified to meet those interests primarily.
Well, that's a couple of great points, and one of the things that I know we look at in our communities as we start to look at decisions we're going to make is how long is this industry? Is it a sunset industry? Is it something that we know is going to be a finite amount of time, or is this something that we're looking to be generational? So there's so many other things that need to be talked about beyond just the dollars and cents, and it's important to keep a record of that as you're discussing that, so when you revisit it, you can actually, get to the points that you were discussing in that relationship that you're building. So I really want to thank you for making some of those points. In this day and age of COVID and Zoom and Whova and all the other apps that we're using to come together and congregate, can project consultation be accomplished with industry by only meeting online? Maybe Chief Corrina, maybe I'll ask you to start in on this one.
Okay, the one with the less connectivity. Yes, we've been working really hard to keep the connectivity open, but I'd just like to make a point in regards to just the consultation process. That's very important to move forward in any of the discussion that we're having, because if we don't have that consultation process and we don't have that clarity, then it's really difficult to distant meet. That's what I'm finding anyways. So we're really trying to, ensure with a community that has very little connectivity. I'm very glad and really happy that I was able to get on this call today. But I really believe in the consultation process and how, just starting from the ground, our grassroots up, and having our opinion brought to the table, and you work from there. Then you move on to, seeing the business plans that are in place, and then you work through all the issues that might be within a business plan that might not fit within your community.
This is some good stuff, and I'm really honored to be part of this session today. And unfortunately, all good things got to come to an end. I see some of the questions are still battling out for which would have been the next one asked, but maybe we'll put a bookmark in that for next year. And I'd like each of you to maybe just give me a minute and a half of something that you maybe left out, or just a real point that you feel needs to be emphasized for our listeners as they go forward and try to build these prosperous relationships and use some of the tools and some of the discussions that we had today. So Chief Harvey McLeod, maybe we'll start with you.
Yes, a really interesting afternoon, and I really thank everybody for giving me the invite. When we look at evolving and emerging two worldviews, I see it as a huge opportunity, not to cause disruption in the way the world operates, but to make it a better world. One of our challenges as a community, as a council, as leadership, is sharing our worldview. This is how it operates according to the world as I see it, how I was raised, how I was taught. And I ask people, don't be scared of it. Like the word consent. Don't be scared of the word consent. There's more than one way to peel an apple, to cut an apple. And just because it isn't your way doesn't mean, and I have another way, doesn't mean that's wrong. Let's find that middle ground where at the end of the day you have a better understanding of who I am and what we're doing and how we can move ahead. Because we as people know and have to rely on what we have around us. And what we have around us is people, companies, land, and we all have needs. We need capacity for housing, education, health, social, economic development, blah, 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 and it goes on and on and on. And we're not going to be able to get that if we don't get out and start doing some of the work ourselves. And we're asking for an opportunity to do that, for an opportunity for others to find and understand what our worldview looks like. And I'm excited about it. And I can't wait to continue learning about it. And a lot of it is through the language. A lot of it is through our creation stories. And because of me having a keen interest in who I am, it's giving me a better understanding of why I'm here. When I first became chief, one of the things I was asking me, what difference are you going to make? I told him I really don't know. I don't know why I'm here. I don't know why the people put me in here. And it didn't take long for me to understand. I'm here to develop a relationship with me first, and then with the council, with the community, and then we keep on extending that boundary so that one day we will see a nation or a valley, more people will get along and have a really good understanding of the input and the value that you bring to living at where you live. Right now, it's seen as good, not maybe not good, but we'll be able to live a learned experience on what I could bring to the world, what this community can bring to the world, and how we can make it better for all of us. Right? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chief. Appreciate your time. Kevin, before I thank the BC NRF committee for having the vision to have a token non-Native lawyer on a panel full of esteemed First Nations leaders, as some of us who've been the token First Nations leader on many panels in previous congregations of resource meetings, you got a minute and tell me what you got.
Well, first of all, it is, as I said before, an honor to be on this panel. But the other thing I'm left with is, a sense of optimism and excitement. Like in my dealings most recently, there's been a lot of energy around, openness to finding creative solutions to find the foundation to build those relationships between companies and Indigenous communities. The one thing that makes me worry is that government in its approach to consent will start treating it like another box to tick off. They'll just keep asking, did you get consent? Did you get consent? And not allow for both companies and nations to have the flexibility to have creative and different relationships that may be built on non-objection, if that's as far as they could get, but allowing things to move forward on that basis regardless. So my one ask to government is keep your mind open. Don't think of this as a box to check, and support companies and communities as they develop their relationships.
Thank you. Appreciate you being here, Kevin. Kim, any last thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with both Kevin and Chief McLeod on a number of issues, but I guess we really can't wait for others to fix the issues that we know have to be resolved. And that's not just on the First Nation side either. I think companies need to ensure they have the proper capacity and strategies in place to advance reconciliation. And I don't think it's just for companies with projects on territories that need to participate. I think Indigenous poverty and those sorts of issues should be something all companies try to help focus on to overcome. And there are plenty of First Nations that are working on these issues and want to advance their economies. And I encourage you to take advantage of that low-hanging fruit and work with chiefs like Chief McLeod and Chief Leween, who's involved with the Major Projects Coalition, which is another group of First Nations that want to advance things. So I'm quite hopeful for the future. Things have changed dramatically since I started in my leadership capacity, and I really look forward to see what can happen in the next decade or so when more and more Canadians wake up to what needs to change in relation to Indigenous matters in Canada. And thanks for having me.
Thank you, Kim. It's always nice to see you, and good luck with Kwantlen Polytechnic and helping to churn out better thinkers for tomorrow's world. So best of luck on that, and nice to see you again. Chief Charlene Leween, the last word to you.
I agree with everybody and everything that has been said. I mean, it's repetitive to our communities, and depending on, what companies we're dealing with, I just really would like to, again, the capacity that we need in our communities is important so that we can do the work that we need to do to get ready for what is evolving out of our individual communities. And I see good things as well. I really do. And I'm just really grateful to have been on the panel today. And glad to hear all of the insight because it's knowledgeable to me. And I'm really glad that, our people are coming out of, we've got so much work to do socially, especially, but we still are, as leaders, we're moving forward, and we're not standing back anymore. And I'm just so excited for this era. So excited.
Okay, well, thank you everybody for your tremendous input into today's discussion. Some days it doesn't look like it, but this is evolving. This discussion is changing, and it's thanks to people like you who are willing to share your personal experience. So the next person, like Chief McLeod, who comes into office saying, oh, hey, where do I need to go? Well, there's more of us out there. It's only plagiarism in college. Oh, Kim, don't listen for a minute. It's only plagiarism in college. It's just good research and networking if you can share these opportunities. So I just want to thank everybody for the opportunity to be here and to help moderate this panel. And while we're doing it remotely, it's always a challenge. We don't get to do the meet and greets like we usually do, but I believe we have a breakout room to have a little bit further discussion on some of these issues. And I can tell you one thing about this COVID thing and not going to these conferences is my liver is feeling a heck of a lot better than it normally would have a year ago today. So thank you everybody, and look forward to seeing some of you in the breakout room, and enjoy the rest of the session. Cheslatta.
Thank you, Dallas Smith, and thank you, panelists, for your participation in our session this afternoon. Well, that brings day one of the 18th annual BC Natural Resources Forum to a close. We truly appreciate the support and participation from everyone. Before we go, we invite you to continue the conversation with the panel in the breakout room. You'll find the post-panel breakout room link in your agenda. We're also pleased to make a donation to the Mining for Miracles campaign in support of BC Children's Hospital Foundation on behalf of all of our speakers today. Since 1988, Mining for Miracles has raised more than $33 million in areas of critical need at the BC Children's Hospital. To learn more, I encourage you to visit their virtual exhibitor booth. We hope that you're enjoying the virtual format so far, and we look forward to seeing you online tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. for another great day of high-quality presentations and virtual networking. We've got leaders from across BC and Canada's resource sectors. We are going to start the day off with Canada's Natural Resource Minister, the Honourable Seamus O'Regan. We'll see you tomorrow.